If something feels easier in muscle growth training, you're probably doing it wrong. If you find a way to squat that you don't hurt your quads as much, like they're not burning and tensed as much, you're like, hey, I'm doing great. Nah, you're strength training now. You want it difficult for the quads in hypertrophy training. In strength training, you want it as easy as possible for everything, but still get through the range of motion. The squat doesn't target the quads when you're strength training, it targets the squat. To the untrained eye, it all looks great. To the trained eye, you're like, well, okay, like that's different. Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for Renaissance Periodization, aka RP Strength. Strength versus size, lifting for both or for either. To the untrained eye, they seem like exactly the same thing, and they largely accomplish a lot of the same stuff. However, if you're a little bit more advanced, you want one versus the other, there are absolutely differences between them, theoretically, and differences in how you would go about training them for the optimal result. And also, you can train them both, and there are slightly better and slightly worse ways to do that. Let's explore this whole topic of size versus strength training. So, first of all, what is size? Size is just how big any given muscle is, and it is directly measured by what's called cross-sectional area. So if you take an MRI of your whole bicep at every millimeter slice, wherever the biggest part of your bicep is cross-sectionally, like if we take this area out and measure it, that's how big your muscles are. It's typically operationalized as cross-sectional area in much of the research community and the research studies. And it can be proxied on a total body level by basically your fat-free mass, which is all of the fat mass in your body subtracted from the rest. And so what's left is muscle and bone and all that other stuff. It's like the best instrument. It's not specifically the absolute gold standard, because there's also lean body mass, which does count some of your fat, like the fat inside of your muscles, which is actually important to making them work properly. But basically you get like a body fat percent, and whatever's left over is in large part, what changes about that over time is the muscularity. So if you go and you're 200 pounds with 10% body fat, a few years later you get a DEXA, and you're 200 pounds or you're with 7% body fat, it's probably not true that your liver and kidneys grew and the body fat went down and that's what makes the difference. It's probably muscle. So a really good way to measure your muscularity over time is to get precise estimates, as precise as possible, every few years with a DEXA or something like that, of your body fat percentage and your total weight, and subtract that out, and what changed is probably muscle. Now, that's what muscle size is. That's what training for size is, just literally making the muscles bigger. What is strength? Strength is strength is a skill. It's the ability to produce force. The most robust and industry standard way to measure it, though there are many others, is to test your 1 repetition maximum in whatever movement you want to test it in, be it a squat or a bench or a deadlift or an overhead press or even a pull-up. Good technique, 1 rep max, the most weight you can lift, just 1 time. A weight you cannot get even 1.5 reps with, just 1 rep. That is the gold standard of strength. There are, in fact, unlike muscle size, which is just how big are your muscles, period, strength actually has 4 subcomponents. Training for strength means you have to attend at some point to these 4 subcomponents. 1 is size. The absolute biggest difference between 2 different people in strength is going to be accounted for by one is just more jacked than the other. You see a person with pecs that pop out phone book style, they probably don't bench 100 pounds. It's probably 4 or 5 or 600 or something like that. So muscle size is the biggest contributor, just like the engine in a car is the biggest contributor. You get a V8, you're going to be doing some numbers on the track. You have a 4-cylinder, there's ways to dope it out and make all the adjustments that get you really good performance, but there's not really any kind of good performance like adding, 4 additional cylinders of engine. So that's muscle size. Very important. However, it's not the only one. There's also muscle architecture. If you train for a specific movement, let's say the bench press, the actual alignment on a microscopic scale of your muscle fibers changes in your triceps, in your front delts, and in your chest to align with a specific bar force pattern that you are training yourself to do. And that alignment is different than if you do dips or if you do an incline dumbbell press. So a big part of training for strength is going to be doing a similar or same movement over and over and over again, sometimes heavy, sometimes light. What that does is it over time realigns your muscle fibers to get you real good at the thing. You guys ever see people who bench a ton, but they're not that jacked? You're like, how are you getting that much out of your muscles? A part of that is muscle architecture. Their muscles are actually shaped in a different way. And if you take them and you go, okay, why don't you do some incline dumbbell presses? You're going to find out that if they haven't been practicing those, they're actually kind of mortal on those. You're like, how are you so good at the flat bench press? Well, they practice practice it a ton, and that gets that muscle architecture to change over time. It's a subtle factor. It's not this huge thing, but it absolutely helps. Two other things. Technique. In hypertrophy training, you lift with a technique, we'll get to this in a little bit, that hits the target muscle. But in strength training, you have to practice the technique that lifts the most weight for you. And that technique can be different depending on the lift and for your own body at any given time. There's an optimal technique roughly that you can shoot for that is just going to engage as many muscles as possible through as short of a range of motion as possible. And it does so in the most efficient manner. So technique is important. If someone is benching in a way that like they touch the bar here, or they touch the bar on their stomach and they're not arching or retracting, you're going to be like, yeah, you're strong. But if you fix your technique, arched, retracted, and touched right at the nipple line, after a few sessions, you're going to be the strongest you've ever been. Even though you haven't like added a ton of muscle or hardly any at all, technique by itself is a big deal. Olympic weightlifters who are really strong, they have excellent, highly practiced technique. Powerlifters and so on and so forth. And technique starts paying dividends like 2 sessions after you started. And it takes weeks and months for you to get crazy, crazy outputs out of technique. You can take someone who is generally strong, muscular, and have them start deadlifting. Just, they deadlift like a regular person. And if you give them good deadlift technique cueing, within probably 8 weeks, you can slap 50 to 100 pounds on somebody's deadlift on technique alone. It really does matter. Now, once your technique is really good, you don't get much out of it anymore. You still have to do the good technique and practice it, but you're not going to be getting a ton more out of the technique as you go. Whereas muscle size is something you can hypothetically keep adding for much longer time. So that's a thing. And lastly, neural drive. When you are being tested in your strength, you have to have muscles of a certain size. Yes. Architecturally, they have to be pointed in the direction of the line of pull. Yes. Your technique has to be really good for that movement. You have to be moving in the right pattern, but also you have to be able to switch on all of the biggest parts of your biggest muscles maximum. And that's neural drive. And that's something you have to practice in strength training, because in hypertrophy training, you just do the reps and get close to failure. You're good. But in strength training, every single repetition has to be at some point of your training, what's called maximum intent to move. You are trying to break that bar through the ceiling. Now, it's too much weight for you to do that, but because the weight pushes back and you push against it, it gets your muscle activation to the highest it can possibly be. Good technique really helps that, but it's not the whole picture. Just grind and drive is a big deal. That's going to determine your strength a lot. So for example, if you weren't feeling motivated and you pulled on a deadlift bar, you're like, I can't get it today. But if someone got you some nose torque, they got you some metal in your earbuds, they got the girl of your dreams to walk by just as you were about to lift. And she's like, oh my God, like if you pick this up, you can totally pick me up after this. And you're like, I guess, sure. And then you pull on it really hard because you're super psychotically motivated. Nothing really changed except for your neural drive. You have literally the same size muscles. Muscle architecture is identical. You didn't learn any new technique from Stacy walking by, unless she's like, hey, dip your hips back and then push to your heels. You're like, damn, Stacy, what's up? You've been hanging around Bulgarian coaches or some shit, girl. Let me put you onto this. And she's like, all right, put it on. And I got nothing. I just was kind of hoping you would just do the thing with me. In any case, all that changed in that example is your neural drive. Your brain was like, hey, muscles, let's go. And that's a practice skill and a big part of strength. So size is just the size of your muscles. Strength is size plus architecture plus neural drive plus technique. So if you can surmise, training for just size almost has to look at least a little bit different than training just for strength, because strength has like other considerations that you just hadn't thought of. Right? It's like if you drive a regular car to and from work, you just don't have to think about anything other than getting the oil going and filling up the windshield wiper fluid and getting the gas going in the car. Like every now and again, every 2 years, a mechanic looks at it and says, fine. But if you have like some kind of racing vehicle that you use, you got to make sure the brakes are working in a way that's makes the most sense. You got to get advanced brakes. You got to look at your tires. There's like tread wear that you have to think about that for a regular car doesn't matter a ton, but for a vehicle you expect a top performance, there's just more to be considered. So in a certain understanding, strength training is a little bit more exotic than size training. That's absolutely true. It's also another reason why bodybuilders can usually just coach themselves in the gym and get a fine result. But very few strength trainees at a high level just do the shit themselves. Coaching is a much bigger deal for the actual session. So much so that Olympic weightlifters very rarely lift by themselves and usually lift in training halls with a coach's watchful eye and all these other factors. I guess he's not watching architecture, but you know what I mean. Technique, damn it. All right. So if you want to set up training for yourself to get bigger, to put on size. What do? What is your training going to look like? So first, the technique should be that the target muscle is the limiting factor. If you're doing bicep curls and you're like, yeah, I feel like my shoulders are giving out before my biceps, you got to change your technique. So it's got to be the target muscle's limiting factor. You're going to see in a little bit when we go through the strength part. Strength is very different. The load and reps, you want loads that get you close to failure, somewhere between 5 rep sets and 30 rep sets. And everything in between and even a little bit outside those works super, super great. So we have a big range in hypertrophy training and muscle size training. It's not going to be the same range in strength training. The relative effort, how hard you push in any working set, is going to be somewhere between 3 reps in reserve, like 3 reps left and you just like stopped. That's actually a really good set. All the way to 0 reps in reserve, which is like you can't get any more reps, and even failure, which is one beyond that. So that's kind of your range. For strength, it'll be a little different, as you'll see in a minute. For volume, this is where there are some big differences. And we'll talk about this when we really open up the differences and compare them. But for volume, if you have a whole body program, multiple days per week, and it's quite balanced, somewhere between 5 sets per muscle group, working sets, all the way up to like 20 working sets per muscle group, depending on the condition of the situation, is going to get you really, really good results and not fatigue you excessively. If you want to just maintain the gains that you have in some muscles, for example, you blasted chest and triceps to the moon for a few months, and now you're going to prioritize your back and biceps, but you don't want to lose your muscle on your chest and triceps. You want that to stay the same for a few months while you're really focused on your back and biceps. What you can do is 3 to 6 sets per week. I know it's not a lot. It's about a third the number of sets you were doing before for hypertrophy will almost certainly keep all of your muscle size on your body. So for hypertrophy in a full body program, 5 to 20 sets per muscle per week. For conservation of gains, maintenance, 3 to 6 sets per muscle per week. And then here's a real doozy. If you lower some of your other muscles as far as volume and bring them to maintenance, let's say you take all of your legs and you push them down to maintenance, your systemic fatigue tolerance opens up. Because it used to be like dealing with your leg training, but now your leg training is down to maintenance, so your legs don't fatigue you much anymore. And now you can train your other muscles more. So when you're focusing on a specific group or several groups at a time of muscles, and your overall ability to do sets per week is the same, but now you do fewer sets for the other muscles, you can actually do more sets because local muscle fatigue usually is a number that's much higher than systemic fatigue for all muscles at the same time. It's kind of like you can have a great time talking one-on-one for 2 hours with 1 or 2 people at a hangout, but if there's 17 people at the party, you just not enough time for you to really have in-depth conversations with any one of them. And if you do, you're going to like straight up not talk to a bunch of people. So if you have that focused, specialized approach to your muscle building program, where you're just taking a few muscles, maybe just half the body or even a third of it, really focusing on it and the rest on maintenance, you can train those muscles each, like you're focusing on biceps, for between 10 sets per week and up to 40 or more sets per week in some cases. So if you're really focusing on a muscle and it's really not growing for you and you've really reduced all the other muscle training to maintenance, you can slowly over the weeks add set and add a set and add 2 sets and add a set and see how it's going. Research time and again shows that, yeah, like for a lot of muscles, for a lot of people, it's not just like 5 to 20 sets per week that are going to get you the best result. A lot of times it's 25, 30, 35, 40, as long as your system can recover, which means don't do this to all your muscles at the same time. So those are the volume recommendations for hypertrophy training, for muscle growth training. Frequency, 2 to 4 times per week per muscle in most cases. You can train a muscle once a week, but 2 is almost always better. And a lot of people can train 5 or 6 times a week for the same muscle, but generally if you're training really hard, you need a little bit more recovery. 2, 3, or 4 times a week per muscle is really ideal for the vast majority of the population. And lastly, progression. How do you change the program week after week in just one mesocycle, one program of it? And for hypertrophy training, you generally add 2.5 to 5 pounds to the bar every week or to the implement that you're lifting, cable, stack, dumbbell, whatever. Or you can add about a rep every week and get roughly the same results. And I was actually one of the researchers involved in a directly published study examining size gains in adding weight over several weeks to the bar or adding just reps and no weight. And the 2 groups, or actually I believe it's one group, was a crossover design. I've been on a few studies now. Who the hell knows what I've even published? Well, slow clap. I have like 3 studies. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. It was was we conclusively illustrated with that study that it didn't actually matter if you progressed through load or if you progressed through repetitions. So for hypertrophy training, if you add load or if you add reps, within 1 or 2 months of time, you get the same gains as far as we can tell. And all the theory would say you get the same gains as long as you're taking everything close to failure. Now, that's for muscle training. How for hypertrophy training for muscle size? What about for strength training? How do we do the strength training? How do we set that up? I'm going to go through this to give you guys great recommendations so you can go make your own program. After this, I'll compare and contrast. A little bit of comparing and contrasting during because I can't help myself. Scott, you ever been around people that the parole officer continue to tell you shouldn't be associating with, but you just can't help yourself?
Yeah, and then they bust out the ankle bracelet.
Why?
Yada, yada.
Why don't you trust me? I'm not going to leave and cross state lines. Why would I do that? I mean, ankle bracelet's kind of a cool flex for like if you're around like thug bitches, you feel me?
Yeah. Like, oh my God, what did you do?
Like, oh my God, you're such a degenerate criminal. Like, I just kind of want to like get it on. And you're like, yeah, I would, but I'm legally not permitted to talk to women of your age. She's like, oh my God, what did you go for? You're like, YouTube would cancel me if I said all of my crimes. In any case, yeah. Strength training. What is the approach to technique? You're going to pick a technique that completely ignores the target muscle. There is no target muscle. It's a movement. The squat doesn't target the quads when you're strength training. It targets the squat. So you're going to pick a technique, and this isn't something that you can just arrive at randomly. You're watching some YouTube videos. Clarence Kennedy or whatever his name is, he knows a ton. Johnny Candido, tons and tons of people that do strength training. Chad Wesley Smith, of course, that you can look at their videos on YouTube and like, check out how to do the movements right for strength. So you do the movement pattern that is the strongest, the movement pattern that lets you lift the most weight, which sometimes doesn't look as pretty as the technique stuff for hypertrophy does, but it gets the job done. And it's the only thing that matters. And a movement pattern that is safe. In hypertrophy training, if you're doing sets of 15, it's just, you got to get really creative to hurt yourself. It's just not enough load to really do the job most of the time. But with sets of 4 to 8 repetitions for basic strength training, which is how you improve your strength the most over time, and with sets of 1 to 3 repetitions for when you're testing your strength or peaking for testing, you can do some damage if it's not a safe bar path. So safety is a big concern there. Not the most big concern, lifting the most weight is, but safety has to be taken into account. And of course, the strongest will mean where you feel the strongest and where the most mechanically efficient path is. So if you see someone deadlifting and the bar is 3 inches out in front of them, even at the knees, that's not how physics works. So a good cue for deadlifting is to keep the bar as close to you as possible because that reduces the lever arm and you can lift more weight. So that's an example of efficient paths that are often universal in the strength training world. Like if someone is benching and they're touching the very low part of their belly, before you guys get to it, not with a bench shirt, just raw, and then they're swinging all the way back up over here, you're going to be like, dude, just touch your chest and then swing a little bit. You're just going to be moving the bar less and it's going to be more stable. It's more efficient. It's better for you. Load and repetitions. For strength training, my recommendation is to do most of your working sets between 4 and 8 repetitions. Close to failure. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But 4 to 8 rep max loads are typically really good. If you get real technical, a 10 RM can be a fine load to lift for sets of 7 and 8 with 3 reps in a reserve. And an RPE of 7 or something like that. That's totally fine too. But basically your working sets of really heavy lifting should be sets of between 4 and 8 repetitions. Now, is it okay for you to do sets of 3? Yes. I wouldn't do a lot of sets of 3 if I was training for strength because 3, 2, and 1 rep are better for peaking. That's like a month or 2 before a serious powerlifting meet. You train mostly sets of 1, 2, and 3. The basic strength that you've built through sets of 4 to 8 is now going to be finely tuned to express itself as a 1 rep max. But the building of strength involves lifting sufficiently heavy to get stronger, but also with sufficiently high volumes. It's easier to get high volumes or amounts of stimulus if you do a little bit more reps than like 2 at a time or something like that. So sets of 4 to 8 repetitions hard are your load and rep breakdown for basically most of your basic strength work. Relative effort, how hard you push in a set. Here's where it gets wacky for strength. We use the RPE scale in strength, rating of perceived exertion, how hard the weight feels to lift, with 10 being you completed that rep and it took everything you had. So because reps in reserve don't work the same way if you're doing sets of 4, you could say something is an RPE of 8, but you couldn't have done another full rep with it. But you could have put significantly more weight on the bar and still done a set of 4. You could put a little bit more weight for 9, a little bit more weight for 10, but a whole nother repetition. That's like 1.25 times the amount of work that you just did, like, or 1.2. That's crazy. That's way out there. So we use RPE for strength, and typically an RPE of 5 to 9 can work. We say 5, well, like a RPE of 5 is like halfway to your best effort. That's true. RPE of 5, we save for technique only work, which we'll get into a bit what that is and why you need to do it. And RPEs of 7 to 9 for most of your heavy work. RPE 10 is something you almost never do except for at a powerlifting meet or a once every 6 months at-home strength training test, because RPE 10 fatigues you like you would not believe and is not a sustainable form of training. Whereas actually training to failure on the hypertrophy rep range typically does fatigue you a bit too much to be all ultra sustainable. But if you lower your volume a little bit, you can work that in no problem. There are almost no powerlifters that train consistently to failure, and a lot of bodybuilders that do. So for powerlifting, we need to actually be a little bit more reserved. For strength training enhancement, a little bit more reserved and staying in that 7 to 9 RPE range. Almost every set you ever do in strength training, you could have done a little bit more. You want to keep it that way so that next week your fatigue is low enough that you can put another 2.5 or 5 pounds on the bar. That's how you make progress. For volume, big difference here. 5 to 15 sets per movement pattern. Like if you do squats and leg presses, it's the same movement pattern, so they both count in there. It's a proxy for muscle group, basically. 5 to 15 sets per week per movement pattern for gains, and 2 to 4 sets per week per movement pattern for maintenance. So notice you can do, literally, in many cases, 2 working sets of bench press per week and never go down on your bench press for months. That's a big unlock, because if your bench is really big, but your squat and your deadlift are not that great, you can take your bench to maintenance and just lose almost nothing or nothing at all for months while cranking the volume and intensity up on your squats and deadlifts and making really serious gains. But cranking the volume here doesn't mean as much, 5 to 15. I have tried training and strength training for more than 15 work sets per movement pattern per week. Usually doesn't do anything good. It'll put size on, but then I should have just been training lighter and training for size. So strength training is going to be substantially lower volume than size training, something I'll review with you guys in just a bit. Frequency for strength training is still 2 to 4 times per movement per week. Per movement pattern, rather. So you'd have some regular squats one day, some belt squats another day, regular squats another day, so on and so forth. However, because strength training very heavy beats you up in a psychological way and in a physical way more than hypertrophy training does, what you typically want to do is keep the number of hard, heavy sessions to about 2 a week, sometimes with deadlifting 1 a week, or even 1 really hard deadlift every other week. It does work like that sometimes for ultra strong people, but basically 1 to 2 hard sessions a week, and oftentimes adding in 1 to 2 technique only sessions. These are sessions in which you use something like 50% of your 1 rep max for sets of just three sets of 3 or 3 sets of 5 or 5 sets of 3, low volume, very little weight. And that's how you get to RP5, by the way. But your intent to move is maximum. You move that weight as if it was the heaviest weight through the exact technique that you use for heavy weight. What that allows you to do is change your muscle architecture, practice your neural drive a little bit, and really get a lot of good technique work. The big downside of only doing 5 to 15 work sets for strength per week and nothing else is you end up having the situation where technique matters a lot for training, but you don't train as much. It's not enough work sets to get you enough practice with the technique. And while your muscles get beat up from heavy lifting real easy, your brain doesn't get beat up from technique that easy. You look at ballet dancers, you look at gymnasts, you look at people who play tennis, you look at people who play ping pong, you look at people who do like art, for example, they don't practice for like a few minutes a week. They practice hours and hours and hours, literally doing the thing. Could you imagine hours of lifting in the 4 to 8 rep range? Legitimately, you would die. So you don't actually get to practice your technique as much as you would like, because the technical ability of your nervous system has a maximum recoverable volume measured in the hours and days per week, not in the minutes and seconds per week, like actually lifting heavy weights. So if you lift hard for 5 to 15 sets per week, but take another, I don't know, gee whiz, 2 to 10 sets per week, sometimes more if you like, to do that light work, RPE5, technique work only, then what you end up doing is getting so much taken care of on the muscle side and the connective tissue side with the heavy stuff and some technique, of course, but you buttress your technique a ton with this extra work that can absolutely make a big difference. So a lot of times people train for strength, you'll come in and you're training for size and you're going hard every time. You walk in and they're doing like really easy stuff and you're like, what's up, fellas? Like, it's just speed work, just light work today. And you're like, why? Why, you wuss? Lift heavy. And the answer is they lifted heavy 2 days ago. They're still too up to lift heavy now. But if they lift light, instead of just taking it easy, their technique increases. They actually tend to recover more because it's running some blood through the muscles, and their neural explosiveness abilities increase, and their muscle architecture goes up. Their muscle size doesn't change because that's too easy to lift for muscle size, but then they come back with the same size muscles, better recovered, with better technique, with better neural drive, with better architecture. That like train heavy on Monday, technique on Wednesday for a specific movement, heavy again on Friday. On Friday, you're going to feel real goddamn crisp. Versus if you just went Monday and Friday and just skipped Wednesday altogether, you're going to get Friday and you're going to start warming up and you're going to be like, I feel off, because there's a groove in strength training. Remember that most maximally efficient, strongest pattern? You got to teach your brain to do that really well. Otherwise, when it comes to lifting, it'll make a little bit of a mistake. And like, look, the bench press bar gets a little bit out in front or behind. That's a missed lift with an RP9. You're done. You get somebody to drag it off of you. That if you're really good at practicing technique often, you're going to be a machine that does it the same way every time. That's how you can start to really, really express your ability. So technique work is a big, big difference between size training and strength training. Now, for progression, for strength training, you add, again, 2.5 to 5 pounds, sometimes more if it's like a leg press, to the bar sort of every week, and you keep going. You typically don't add reps because the purpose of strength training is to make you stronger. The definition of stronger is lift more weight. It's not do more reps. If you have someone who can, pick up something really heavy for 5 reps and somebody else can pick up something a little bit lighter, but for 12 reps, who's stronger? Well, by absolute definition, the guy who lifted the heavy weight for 5 reps. That's just what the sport is. That's what the task is. So when you're progressing in strength training, it's almost always better to progress in weight, even though you could challenge yourself to progress in reps. Every time you progress in reps and strength training, it changes the training to a little bit less strength oriented and a little bit more size oriented. And because muscle size eventually helps you get stronger, that still works, but it's not ideal. So when you're training for size, you definitely want to add weight and or reps, and it just doesn't matter as long as you're in that 5 to 30 rep range, which one it is. But for strength training, 4 times out of 5, you're going to want to add load. You're going to want to add weight on the bar. Sometimes if you start with sets of 4 and you kind of want to work up, you haven't been strength training in a while, you're going to want to work up to sets of 6 with a similar weight. You can get away with doing that. Sometimes there's context. Usually it's just adding weight for strength training, which again makes total intuitive sense as well. All right, so let's take a look at the commonalities and differences now that we've explained both in size and strength training. Biggest commonalities of strength and size training, which is why to the untrained eye it often looks the same. Like if you bring a person in who hasn't been in the gym but a week and they're like, okay, tell me the bodybuilders apart from the powerlifters. They're going to be like, I don't know. I have no idea. That guy's big. They're like, he's a powerlifter. Like, oh, God damn it. That guy's lean. He's a powerlifter. That guy looks a little out of shape. Like he's actually a bodybuilder, believe it or not. His name's Dr. Mike. It's ridiculous. Why does he even bother? So there are differences, but let's talk about the similarities. Lots of compound high muscle mass movements are used. Bodybuilders use leg presses, hack squats, and squats, just like powerlifters do. They do compound pressing. They do pulling. A lot of the guys do all the same similar movements because a lot of the movements that are effective for making you stronger are also damn good at taxing the shit out of your muscles. Sweet. Lots of attention paid by both people training for strength and size to good technique and deep ranges of motion. Because in powerlifting, if you don't get deep, they just red light your squat and you don't have a squat on the board and you showed up to the meet for no goddamn good reason. So you got to get low in all those movements. The bench press in powerlifting ends at your chest. So like you have to go all the way down. And in muscle growth training, deep stretch under heavy load is really, really good for gains. So good technique is different for both of these, but there is still such a thing as good technique. If you see someone in the gym YOLOing just the worst technique ever, someone's like, you see a powerlifter or a bodybuilder, you're like, he's just a clown, I think. And I go, correct. Actually, yep, Alex Trebek. The answer is ding, 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 it's clown for 500. Like, here you go. Here's your bonus money. If you see a powerlifter training, it's going to look different. But if you see a bodybuilder training, it's going to look different. But both, you can tell, are their attention to technique is quite meticulous. Every one of their reps looks roughly the same every time. And that's how you know they're like actually trying. Next, both training for strength and size require training hard and pushing yourself to discomfort. There is no easy way out of any of this. Oh, sure. When you're training for strength, your light work, your technique work, it looks easy. And it is much easier, but that's not all the work you do, because then you have to come in later that week and go harder and heavier than anyone in the gym. And that is its own special level of brutal. Whereas with hypertrophy training, the guys might not go as heavy, but the sets are close to failure and the high reps are especially like super painful. So training hard and pushing yourself to discomfort. If you're doing this, if you're like, man, training for muscle size is too hard, I want to try strength training. Nah, man, it's just a different kind of hard, and vice versa. Next commonality is that training every muscle and or movement occurs for both strength and muscle size, roughly, 2 to 4 times per week. 2 to 4 times per week for both seems like really good. So a lot of commonalities there. And the biggest commonality is that every single week, you're going to try to make the exercises more difficult. In muscle growth, that's increase the weight or the reps. And in strength training, it's increase just the weight, but something's got to give. There's no way to train for either size or strength in the gym where you come in and every week you do basically the same thing with no changes. I mean, you could do that, but it's not going to get you your best results. All right, those are the commonalities. Let's talk about the differences and dive in a little deeper. Big difference here is in technique. Muscle-focused technique versus movement-focused technique. For muscle size, your technique is focused on the target muscle, let's say the quads. For strength, it's going to be on the movement, which is the squat. Let's use the squat as an example. How does the technique look different? First is bar position. The best squat on average for most powerlifters, people trying to lift as much weight in the squat as possible, strength training, is the low bar position. For muscle size, it's the high bar position. The low bar position lets you leverage your back better, and it actually lets you lift more weight. But the high bar position exposes your quads more to tension and takes your back more out of the movement. So there's no right or wrong answer. It's just like, do you want bigger quads or do you want to lift the most weight you can? It's either high or low bar. 2 different techniques for the same exercise, in fact. Another one is elevated heels versus flat heels. If you have a decent heel elevation, then you can swing your knees out in front and stay super upright, which really crushes your quads. If you have flat shoes, a lot of times that distributes the load very evenly in your foot and allows you to distribute the load evenly between the quads and the glutes and the lower and mid back in the low bar squat. So in the low bar squatting, a lot of times some guys do have heel elevation, but typically the heel elevation is smaller or non-existent in serious strength training, but the heel elevation is substantial or actually quite egregious if you kind of stand on blocks. That can still be a great way to do hypertrophy training. One thing you'll notice is if your heel elevation comes up a lot, you can't lift as much weight. So like that's for sure not ideal for strength training. But if your heel elevation is minimal, even if you have some, you can lift a lot of weight. You feel like you can distribute the load, not just to your quads. As soon as you get up on a heel, the load's going on your quads. If you get off that heel, the load's going back into quads and glutes and lower back, which is what you want, because in strength training, you want to distribute the load to as many muscles as possible so that no one muscle is the limiting factor. Notice that is the exact opposite of what you want to do with hypertrophy training, muscle growth training. Another difference in the squat is butt tracking. Which way do your hips and butt go? In the squat for muscle growth, you kind of want it, even if you swing out a little bit at the beginning to unlock your knees, you want your butt kind of to go straight down, even straight down and a little bit forward so that you can really push into your knees and get your quads really stretched and separated at the bottom. Total brutality in the best way possible. However, that is putting all the stress and load onto your quads, and like you have a bunch of other muscles in your leg that can help you lift the weight. So for strength training, you actually want your butt to go back as it goes down, which allows you to sit into your glutes, lean over at the bottom to engage your back. So now it's quads plus glutes plus back. And that's what lifts the weight in the squat for pure strength. It's a difference. It looks different to the untrained eye. It all looks great. To the trained eye, you're like, well, okay, like that's different. If anyone ever saw me squatting in a gym and had, been around the sport for a while, they'd be like, that guy's for sure training for size. Whereas if you see a powerlifter squat, a pure powerlifting squat, it's not difficult to say like, oh, that guy competes, guaranteed. No, but how else would he do low bar and a pause for every single one of these reps? Another one is depth. That can be a big difference. In the squat for hypertrophy, if you can sit your ass on your ankles, you get better results than at any point if you cut it off, because high forces at the most stretched muscle position seem to be the thing that causes a lot of growth. That's just a reality. You can try it yourself. You get way more sore, way more fucked up if you sink it. In powerlifting competition or for strength generally, you can train for strength through a totally full range of motion if you want. A lot of athletes do that. But for powerlifting competition, you actually just have to get just below parallel and come back up. And if you train super deep all the time, your body's technique ability to just stop at parallel and go back up isn't the same, and you actually can't lift as much weight. So another difference between squatting for size versus strength is size, you dunk it every single time. Strength, you dunk it until you get just below parallel, and then you come back up. Big difference. Another one is using different kinds of feedback for your body while you do the lift. For hypertrophy, you want to use mind-muscle connection feedback. Like when I'm squatting and I'm sitting down, do I feel my quads tensing and being painfully pulled apart and burning? If I'm not feeling that, I got to sit down and forward more, change something, because I'm supposed to be feeling my quads. And if I am feeling that, the more I can rig my technique and motion, maybe a little bit more down, maybe a little more forward, maybe spread my knees open to get more of that, the better it is for me. For strength training, it's very different, because what you're choosing is the path of least resistance. If you're doing a squat and you're coming up and you start coming up and forward, that's going to feel really hard. If you're coming up and you come up and back too much, that's going to feel really hard. You're off balance, you can't produce as much force. But if you come down and you follow the path of least resistance, that doesn't have to be snake-shaped, I guess. Someone's like, damn, that guy's doing Scott, new exercise, RP branded, approved snake squats.
Ooh, we love it.
You go down straight.
You're on the snake diet as well.
Yes, snake diet, snake squats. You come up and you do the snake pattern on the way up.
Ooh.
And the best gains that you can get is when you do the hiss, because nobody's going to, So you come up, you go down, you breathe in or down, come up and you go, you guys, you don't have to say that last part. It's always nice.
That's a different kind, special kind of snake there.
Snake. I got a little snake for you, Scott. You feel me? I did say a little snake. It's like a worm, really. You know when you look at, like, you take a biology class, like ecology, and you point to the textbook, you're like, that's a worm. And your teacher's like, technically, it's phylogenetically a snake. That's where I'm coming from.
Got it.
Yeah. Path of least resistance. So don't snake your way up. But when you're coming up, you're going to notice that if I don't go too far forward, if I don't go too far back, it's easy. It feels easier for me to lift the weight. If something feels easier in muscle growth training, you're probably doing it wrong. If you find a way to squat that you don't hurt your quads as much, like they're not burning and tensed as much, you're like, hey, I'm doing great. Up, 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 up. Nah, you're strength training now. You want it difficult for the quads in hypertrophy training. In strength training, you want it as easy as possible for everything, but still get through the range of motion. So that is just two very different North Stars to aim for. And for a long time, when I transitioned from strength training, because I used to be a competitive powerlifter, not so good at it, I was fine, and then transitioned to bodybuilding training and hypertrophy. I mean, to say that it took me years to really clean out the mindset would be a lie. I still struggle with this, because you guys know what I'm talking about. You're squatting for size and you're feeling your muscles, and you have like your RP hypertrophy app. You're like, last week you did 280 pounds for a set of 10. This week it's 290 or 285. And you're like, I got to get 10. And you the ninth rep is pretty tough. it's so easy to slip back into strength training mode and be like, just do the next rep efficiently. Go bloop, bloop, you get it done. You're like, hey, I did 10. But you're not fooling your muscles. You're not fooling your quads. So the real art form emerges with very advanced training of where you're able to try really hard for hypertrophy training, for muscle growth training, but still keep the tension on the target muscle and not switch to efficiency mode. On the other hand, if you have been doing some size training, you get to strength training, and you're like doing bench, and you're like, yeah, I feel like my pecs, shut up, stop. Nobody cares. Don't pay attention to your pecs. That's wrong. Pay attention only to the bar path and find that groove that's the path of least resistance. You're like, yeah, but I don't really feel my chest this way. Good, motherfucker, nobody cared. Can you imagine a bench press competition in which the guy racks and there's no lights? So you're like, did I get it? And the judges are like, did you feel your pecs? You're like, I don't think so. They're like, red light. Like, what the hell? Some kind of mind-muscle connection competition? Scott, that's another brilliant idea. Mind-muscle connection lifting competition. It's not who lifts the most weight. It's we put an EMG on everyone and see like, who can activate their quads the most.
That's funny. I thought it was like honor system at first, where you just ask the people how good their muscle connection.
Did you feel it? They're like, their coach like from the back's like, say yes. Like, I did. They're like, congratulations, gold medal. Like, what the hell is going on? So you guys can tell it's a very, very different thing. And this can take to be the best at strength training or hypertrophy training. You really have to clean out your mindset and be like, I'm here intending to do this. Now, in any single given rep, what you're chasing mentally, other than good technique, is different from size training and strength training. For training for size, you're chasing the mind-muscle connection. Every rep, you should feel your quads tearing, yes. For strength training, every rep, you should have the maximum intent to move. The concentric begins, you're going to go, oh, sorry, I'm doing a bench example. You're going to come up in the squat like you're trying to jump into the sky. Maximum intent to move under heavy weight is critical because the heavy weight won't move unless you try really hard. Whereas with hypertrophy, if you try really hard on the concentric, that's cool, it's good. But if you tried so hard that you lost track of what you were contracting, you're going to get glutes involved, lower back involved. If you're trying to keep it in the quads, mind-muscle connection is something that is front of mind for you the entire time. So even during the rep itself, technique aside, there's a different focus there. And lastly, for this squat example is based on how you move in the technique, you are trying to avoid axial fatigue in the squat when you're hypertrophying your quads, because axial fatigue, the fatigue of compressing your spinal cord, is kind of special. It gets really high and it takes a long time to bring down. It interferes with other training and it doesn't really help you get bigger quads. So you're going to take a very upright posture in the squat for hypertrophy to keep your axial fatigue minimal, because every time you tilt your spine, it requires a crap load of muscle activity of the paraspinal muscles to keep your spine straight. That tends to fatigue it in a very special way. So you're going to try to do a very vertical technique in the squat, but in strength training, you actually purposefully want to tilt your spine and your entire hip structure to do kind of like 60-degree angle at your hips and then let your legs do the rest of the work. What that does is it leverages your legs to have an easier time of it and using your back to help. For axial fatigue for strength training, you don't really care about it. That's the reason. One of the big reasons why strength training has such lower volumes is you have to account for the axial fatigue. But it's not like you're going to tell a strength trainer, hey, like stay more upright in your squat. Like don't do that. That just shifts the load only to your quads, and only your quads is a real sad party to come to for lifting the most weight in the squat. In the properly executed squat, man, you want your pinky muscles to do some shit. You feel me? I'm kidding. But for sure, quads and glutes and adductors and somehow even hamstrings and your lower back. And for that, you're going to tilt your body a little bit. And so it actually looks different when you're doing the movement. Even if it's low bar versus high bar, even more of a tilt is a big deal for strength training. These are subtle differences when you're not accustomed to training. But when you know what's going on in the training room, you can tell who's who real quick. Another difference between size and strength training is obviously the repetition range. I mean, 5 to 30 reps is a big range, no wrong answers. That's kind of cool for size. But for strength training, really most of your strength training should occur with sets of 4 to 8 repetitions. Can you get stronger? Sets of 9 and 10. As a beginner, yes, but then everything works. As an intermediate, definitely, but you would get stronger if you did sets of 4 to 8. Could you get stronger if you did sets of 2 and 3, even sets of 1? Yes. It's just not the most time efficient or fatigue efficient way to get there, because you have to do lots more sets, and walking the bar out and walking it back in and set up and unrack and time at the gym, it just gets super annoying. Like, there's a decent way to train that Louis Simmons popularized, which was like 10 sets of 2, like 10 sets of 2 repetitions each. Lets you go really heavy, lets you get good practice. The thing is though, like if you were doing just sets of 5 instead or sets of 6, you would get almost all the same heavy work in, but you could increase the amount of work substantially and save time in the gym and not be as frustrated because every time you walk out the bar, you get a little bit more of a chance to work. So my personal preference for most basic strength training is to be in sets of 4 to 8. And then when you're ready to peak, then the sets of 1, 2, and 3 come in. You can do sets of 2 to 8, no problem, and have a great time. You can even do sets of 2 to 10, but I would say most beneficial strength work is in sets of 4 to 8. But if you said to someone, hey, listen, sets of 4 to 8, how to put on size and strength the best, they'd be like, but aren't there like a whole lot of other reps in the top end of the rep range for size? And like, nah, man, that's all stupid, but that would not be true. So strength training is considerably more constrained, which is why, like, if you're traveling, you get to a hotel gym and you're trying to train for muscle size and your friend is training for strength, you could look around, there's like 40, 50 pound dumbbells, lat pull down. You're like, yeah, I could train here today. You look at them and they're like, I need heavy weights or it's pointless for me to be here. And you're like, okay, that's true. Let's go find a gym for you. And you drive around town, find a gym, and turns out you don't have a lot of money. And the gym owner is very permissive, but he's like, look, is there anything you could trade me that's not money for me letting you get into the gym and do your thing? And well, look, good news, you get 2 glute workouts that day. These are memories, folks. They're not jokes. I've done terrible things to my body in order to get the strength training in. But hey, I got here. And my pride is non-existent. You've put in the work over the years and you've made good gains. But now you're ready to create your most impressive physique ever. And the RP Hypertrophy app is designed to make this possible. You can customize every single aspect of your training plan, or let the app's AI take the lead. Whichever combination you use, your results will climb higher than ever. All you have to do is bring the effort. Click on the link in the description of this video to get started. Relative effort. The relative effort in size training and strength training, how hard you're trying in any given working set, is very similar. However, subtly different. 2 big differences. Difference number 1 is in strength training, we actually just talk about rating of perceived exertion measured on a 1 to 10 scale. 1 is like standing up off of your couch and going to the fridge and getting a Coke and sitting back down. 10 is like deadlifting your car off of your screaming, dying child because of a crazy car accident. Full send. And so in most strength training, the technique work would be RP 5, heavy enough to make you feel something, but quite easy. And then most of your basic strength working sets would be RP 7, 8, and 9. Tough, very tough, but not all the way to the limit, because going to failure is brutal on your fatigue and strength training, but not as big of a deal on hypertrophy training. For hypertrophy training, the big difference is we do RIR, reps in reserve. So how many reps you could have done until failure. And that's, 3 to 0, which is really similar to 7 to 9 RPU, not exactly the same thing. However, in hypertrophy training, you can fail quite regularly or definitely fail occasionally. Whereas in strength training, good God, I suck at this. In strength training, failure really is not a good idea. So those are the 2 subtle differences. For strength training, you do RPE and you go close to failure, but not quite. And then for size training, you do reps in reserve and you can get close to failure, not quite, or you can regularly train to failure and get excellent results. There's just not really anyone going to failure all the time in strength training getting their best possible results. It's just not a thing. Next, big difference. We talked about this a little bit, so I'm not going to paint this too much, but volume, big difference. Roughly speaking, on average, and there are exceptions, strength training is going to require, and be the most you can recover from, about 2/3 the volume of hypertrophy training. So if you have like 50 total work sets in your whole weekly program for size training, yeah, you're looking at more like somewhere between 25 and 40 sets for strength training. It's a difference. It's a notable difference. And the difference is even bigger compared to hypertrophy specialization. So if you really want to specialize on your biceps, you could be doing 40 to 50 sets of biceps per week. Not for everyone, but sometimes it works. If you try to get your biceps as strong as possible and you're doing 40 to 50 sets per week, you're doing something exceptionally wrong. And another thing about this volume difference is how it presents. And this is a big deal. When you are training for strength, you want to be able to have good workouts, but the progression is the big thing. Because if you're not able to add weight next week, like you're not actually getting stronger in any meaningful way. So what you want to do is train hard for strength training, but really hold back so that you can train hard again and heavy again next week and the week after and the week after that. The last week before a deload, you can full send it, do some higher volumes or go close to failure, no big deal. But for most weeks of strength training, it's a big deal that you can come in and jam. You don't want to be super fully exhausted. For hypertrophy training, for muscle growth training, fully exhausted muscles that just barely recover for their next session is probably the way to get the best gains. So if you're really beat up from high volumes in hypertrophy training and muscle growth training, that just is what it is. A lot of people who come from strength training, they try hypertrophy training, like, dude, I'm f***ed up. And the only thing to say to them is like, yeah, like next week you'll be just as f***ed up. It's just what we do. They're like, yeah, but I don't feel like my strongest. Like, yeah, nor do you have to be. They're like, oh, God damn it. This sucks. It's boring and it's painful. Like, haha, welcome to size training. But for strength training, you got people who come from a size background. They'll do the 3x5 squats, 2 sets of heavy belt squats after. And they're like, what else? You're like, we're done. See you in 3 days for the light work. And they're like, what? But like, I could keep going. Oh, I know you could keep going right now for more volume, which would cause you to get bigger. We're not here for that. We're here to really send a good signal to get you stronger and then chill the f out. And then later on, you're going to be able to come back and be so fresh and ready that you're going to do the shit again. It's like the difference between training for marathon running and training for breakdancing. If you are really fatigued and you have to do another long run for marathon training, smoke a cig and get to it, because that's the sport. You're going to be fresh like once, and that's going to be like the morning of your actual race. That's when you feel pretty fresh. The other time, you're just some form of beat to shit. Whereas if you train for breakdancing, yeah, you're going to get beat up and you're going to get sore, but unless you have that rhythm, you guys see that shit? Scott, you see this shit, baby? You feel me? I used to breakdance, but they told me that I was so good. I was just taking away like clout from other people. And so I was like, all right, I'll let you guys have your little sport.
You're too good.
Yeah. Did you not hear it when I said it earlier?
Yeah.
Are you doubting me, Scott? I feel a little bit of that teen rebellion in your voice.
No, genuine.
As genuine as my breakdancing ability. But like breakdancing, the moves are technical. They're very complex, and you got to feel your vibe and your flow. You got to be athletic to get them going. And if you're so beat up that you're like sore and tired and you can't even do the shit, like you just need to sit down and practice some basics and maybe some body weight exercises and watch the other guys do their practice and help them with their shit, because you don't have it that day. So consistently beating the shit out of yourself, breakdancing is not a good idea. Every time you show up to do like really good practice in breakdancing, you got to feel pretty free and pretty fresh. Joints have to feel good. Muscles have to feel good. So the amount of volume you can cram into a marathon running program is like 5 times the amount you could do for breakdancing, because one of them you need to feel fresh to do the thing, whereas the other one you don't. Same for size and strength training. So here's the public service announcement. You're training for size, your degree of total how beat up I feel in my muscles is going to be much higher than for strength training. On the other hand, for strength training, how your joints are going to feel is going to be the opposite. You're going to be like, damn, my elbows kind of hurt a little bit. And it's like, well, time to go heavy again. This is what you signed up for. Frequency, big difference. Here's the big difference. The frequency is the same. However, in size training, light sessions, they kind of just don't do much of what you want. If you come in and your biceps aren't sore and they're roughly recovered in strength, you're going to do your biceps like you always do them. 4, 6, 8 sets of biceps, whatever it is that day, you're going to crush them. Because in hypertrophy training and muscle growth training, you either train it to grow or you just go home and rest. In strength training, you're going to have the same frequency or very similar 2 to 4 times a week, but some of those sessions will be hard and some will be light technique sessions. So that's really the big difference. If you see someone doing a light technique session for hypertrophy, they just kind of misunderstood the term hypertrophy and muscle growth training. But if you see someone who is strength training, who is pretty advanced, they say, I only ever even give it full send or I just don't show up to the gym. Charitably, you could be like, you could be better if you showed up and did light workouts. And almost everyone in strength training and strength sport will tell you like light workouts are a big deal, man. They're really helpful in a ton of different ways. In hypertrophy training, it's just not a thing. So big difference there. And of course, talked about this a lot already. So super quick, there's a fundamental difference in progression. For muscle growth training, increasing in load or increasing in reps is rock solid as long as you're still in that 5 to 30 rep range. Because, you don't want to increase reps to like 46 and you're like, they said increasing reps is going to be good. Now I'm just getting the burn and I'm getting smaller. Don't do that. But for size training, that totally works to do both. For strength training, there are times and contexts when you can increase reps, especially if you're at the very low end of like the 2 to 8 range and 2 and then 3 and then 4, maybe. As a beginner, maybe. New movement, maybe. But in most cases, it's going to be you put weight on the bar, which has a certain sense of brutality to it. It's in hypertrophy training. Actually, here's another difference real quick. Bonus difference. This is getting real sciencey. In hypertrophy training, what movements you do in a certain session don't matter a ton. If the pull-up bar is taken or your pull-up's kind of feeling weird, you just want to do some rows and pull downs and you want to change the rep range, it's totally fine. As long as you zap the muscle, you're getting the more or less the same hypertrophy and muscle growth results that you would. Strength training is more specific. The brutality comes not only from the fact that you did 255 for a set of 4 on the squat last Monday. It's 266. It's 260 or 265, dealer's choice. What you're going to do today? You're like, can't I just do 245, but for higher reps? Nope. It's not strength training anymore. Like, oh, God damn it. And then you'd be like, okay, can I not squat today? Can I just do like hack squats? Nope. You're training for the squat. The neural, the architectural factors, the technique factors are all squat specific. They're a little bit different enough in hack squats for it to be a very different movement and not transfer to strength directly by any means. So if you're in a strength training block, you don't feel like going up from 255 to 260, and you don't feel like squatting, now it's time to do a light session instead until you get to feeling like it and do that hard work. The brutality of strength training is the linearity of it. It's you do this. This is really the only answer. So if you don't feel like squatting and you come in to do strength training, you better start feeling like squatting real goddamn soon. Get the headphones going, whatever you need to do. Whereas if for whatever reason you don't feel like squatting for hypertrophy, hey, there's a hack squat, there's a leg press, there's lunges, there's leg extensions to your heart's content. So the variation that you can do session to session if needed for hypertrophy training is very broad. Whereas for strength training, it's either like you're either going to do the same movements hard and harder and with more weight, not reps, not anything else, or you're going to do a light session because you feel too like shit to do a hard one. It's really quite binary. Strength training is more straightforward, which is cool because it's very simple, but it's brutal because you're like, this is it, man. This is it. You're playing a fighting video game and you're like, can I pick the big guy? You're like, nope. You pick the little girl character and you're like, God damn it. Can I? Nope. Same thing. Start the game. You got to get good at doing that one thing because that's what's going to be tested. You can get real good at hack squats. Nobody gives a shit at the powerlifting meet when your squat actually sucks because you barely do it. All right. Lastly, let's talk about how to train for both of them at the same time. At the same time, I mean, in the next several months or year, you're going to want to be both really strong, kind of a lot, and really big, not trading off much. So you want both. There are 2 ways to train for both. One is at the same time, and 2, like in the same week and month, etc. And the other one is phasically. Like you train for one for a little while, you train for another for a little while. Let's talk about how you would train them best. Roughly, there's a few different ideas on this, which we're all totally good to go, but here's a really good way to train for both sides and strength at the same time. You start almost every session with strength work. Why? Because you're the freshest and you need to be fresh to lift your heaviest weights because that's the point of strength. Primary strength work for the day in the first 1 to 2 exercises in the 4 to 8 rep range. Check. Got them done. And then add 1 to 2 exercises on top of that in the 5 to 10 rep range or the 10 to 15 rep range for size. Notice we're not going into the higher rep ranges of 15 plus because the cellular demands, metabolic demands, the nervous system demands are so different that training very high reps and very low reps can really dilute the value of low rep training. Your body's like, I don't know what to get good at. But if you take your size work and you just sprinkle in a little bit more of it, and you try to keep it as heavy as possible, sets of 5 to 10, sets of 10 to 15, which are in the hypertrophy rep range, but at the lower end, then the similarity of training is close enough that your strength training isn't as hampered and can do a real good job of expressing itself. The upside of this approach, so just TLDR, the approach is come in, train a couple movements heavy, 4 to 8 reps, then train other movements, other exercises in addition to that to get more volume in, sets of 5 to 15 reps. The upside is it's brutally simple. You just do this every time you come in and you don't have to think much, no phases, no weird periodization bullshit. No offense, company name. It's super simple. The downside, it is just never ideal for either. Because if you train purely for strength to be your best, the extra fatigue of size training is just an infectious poison that makes you less recovered for more strength training later. But if you're training purely for size, all of these sets of 4 to 8 reps take so much out of you fatigue-wise, but there's just not that much volume, so they don't grow you a ton. So if you wanted to get your biggest and you were like, how many really heavy sets at the beginning should I do? The answer is none. Just start sets of 5 to 30 the entire time. So the trade-off is it's not ideal for either to train this way, but you get good measures of both, especially as a beginner intermediate. And the other thing is there's no variation here. It's not like you're doing some things differently for a few months and some things differently for another few months. Like every time you come into the gym, it's kind of the same. First I go heavy, then I go light. First I go heavy, then I go light. If you get bored of that, if that gets stale, I don't really know what you're supposed to do at that point because there's doing everything all at the same time. So it's like being in a relationship with someone for a real long time and you're just sick of every thing they do. Hey, can you pass the remote? My show is on your show. The remote, this relationship. I'd leave, but I have nobody else. Anything, Scott?
We got nothing.
Oh, you a text message breakup kind of motherfucker, aren't you?
I've done both.
That's my dog. Rough. Folks, in the comments.
I've done some interesting things to break up with girls, as you know.
As I know. I'm an out, and I zip the lip. Folks, in the comments, tell us a story, one of two stories. One, or true, no bullshit. You can feel free to bullshit. A story about how you broke up with someone in the most, what other people would consider brutal way possible. Or tell us an even longer story about how you just don't have that value other people see in others and why you are continuously single and miserable. See you in the comments. All right. So there's that problem with trying to do them both at the same time. You never really get the super best result for either one. And if it gets stale, it's kind of like, what the hell am I supposed to do? Now, how to train both of them in a phasic manner, which is better, but more complex. You do 2 to 4 months of mostly strength training. You can have the option of doing a little bit of maintenance work for size for vanity muscles. Because you want big biceps, but none of the power lifts really have anything bicep related. So you do all your powerlifting stuff, your squat, bench, press, deadlift, but then you do a few sets of curls. Totally cool. And then after 2 to 4 months, you get really strong, really good at strength training. You might even do a competition at the end. Then you do 2 to 4 months of mostly size training. You have an option to do 2 to 4 per week per movement, like per bench, per squat, per deadlift, each 2 to 4 working sets heavy in those core strength moves to really maintain that strength. You don't really have to do that. I'll get to that in a little bit, but some people like it and it's totally cool. And then the rest of your program is purely oriented for size. You have to do that core work first in the sessions and proceed with side work. So it really looks a lot like training them both, but you do very little strength at the beginning and a lot more hypertrophy training in the end of the session. If you like to train for size in sets of 10 to 15 to 20 plus reps, keeping in that core strength work does absolutely benefit to keep you sharp so that when you come back to strength training, you're coming back from 0 instead of back from negative, whatever strength you lost by just going for super high reps and re-architecting your body's nervous system and everything to do high reps and really forgetting how to do the low reps. However, if most of your size work for this 2 to 4 month size phase is in the 5 to 10 rep range, that's so heavy and so close enough to 4 to 8 that within 1 or 2 weeks of coming back to mostly strength training, you're going to feel golden even if you do no maintenance work. And The way you figure out which one works best for you is by trying them both. So try a size phase in which you keep in some core maintenance strength work, and then try another size phase months and years later where you to keep in no core strength work, but it's mostly sets of 5 to 10 that you're doing, and then try to see how your body comes back into strength training after that. You're going to be looking for two things really. One is like, how strong are you and how good is your technique? Because if you do a phase where you abandon strength training altogether and you come back to strength training, it's just like weeks of slog of like, oh my God, everything feels off and I'm weaker. And then you do another phase where you do some strength work, mostly size, you come back to strength and everything's grooving. Hey, that's good. That's what you want to look for. Whereas if you do a bunch of just pure hypertrophy work, you come back to strength and it's just groovy right away. You do a bunch of core strength work and it just doesn't seem to make a difference. Well, then like, why would you do that work if it's not making a difference? And you could get more size by doing more size work. So you might as well put kind of the marbles where they matter. The other thing you're looking for, so that's thing one, is like, how are actually the results feeling for you? And do you really need that core work? Because remember, it's expensive. It comes at the trade-off of doing more size work in your size phase. Whereas the other thing you're looking for is, how are your joints and connective tissues? There's one big downside from even maintenance levels of core strength work. It's that they're so heavy. Your elbows and shoulders and knees might have gotten a little bit beat up, as they tend to do from strength training much more than size training because the absolute loads are heavier. If you bring in some kind of sore elbows, knees, and toes, isn't there a song like that? Some shit, Scott?
Head, elbows, knees and toes.
Macarena.
Eyes and ears and mouth and nose.
Because I didn't go to school in the United States up until I was age 7, I'm like familiar with none of that shit. And I never watched Sesame Street. Am I missing out?
You never heard that song?
No, not really. Like, I heard it in passing, but everyone knows the words to it because they were a child. They like practiced it, but I know the words to the Soviet national anthem.
I think it's royalty free.
Are you sure? Because we're going to get kiboshed. Can you imagine this video gets kiboshed because of this bullshit?
Oh my God, the song has 1.2 billion views.
See?
Jeepers.
I'm not one of those people. Scott, you know they're going to flag you for looking at children's shows on your laptop, right? In any case, you come in with already pretty messed up joints. Nothing crazy, but you're like, oh man, I can't wait for hypertrophy work because I'm going to go lighter and my joints are going to heal, which is typically how it happens. But if you include this base of strength, you could be not messing your joints up anymore, but you also could be preventing their full recovery. So when you get into your next strength series of mesocycles, your next strength block, and it's back to mostly strength training, a week later, you could be like, I can't do this. My elbows are, I can't. Whereas if you had no strength work and you just did sets of 5 to 10 hypertrophy work, you could come into that phase potentially and be like, dude, I'm golden. I'm healed up and I'm ready for 2 to 4 months more of strength work. So what you really have to watch out for, if you do pure hypertrophy or if you do a little bit of hypertrophy and combo with strength, is my body sustaining this? Do I need this? Am I getting better consistently because of always including some strength work? If the answer is no, then you just might as well move to hypertrophy. And how are my joints doing? Because if the answer is my joints aren't doing so well, it's time to pull away completely from strength work for months on end during the year and do only size work. So your muscles get bigger, but your joints can take a chill pill. And even if that means you got to work back into strength, hey, do you want to work back into strength and 2 weeks later be the strongest you've ever been? Not just right out the spot. Or do you want broken up joints that just don't work anymore? And people are like, do you train for hypertrophy and strength? They're like, actually, I just smoke cigarettes at home, which is nice, but it fills up your house with gunk. That is how you would do this. Now, after you do 2 to 4 months of mostly strength training and then 2 to 4 months of mostly hypertrophy training, you come back and repeat the cycle. And over time, you get bigger, stronger, bigger, stronger, bigger, stronger. It's a great way to do things. Either one of these is fine, both the concordant approach where you do them at the same time or the phasic approach where you split them into 2 or 4 months phases. If you are a beginner, my recommendation to you is to know what goals you have and do the highest priority to what is good for you at the same time. And at the same time, remember your training age. So here's how it works. As a beginner, you should probably lift, if you want some measure of both sides and strength, for both sides and strength. So that first one where you do heavy work first, lighter work after. That's great. But as you get more advanced, you're going to realize that you have a harder time pushing both up at the same time. That is when you should consider trying the phasic approach. As you become more advanced, you notice it's hard to make strength and size gains at the same time. And every time I make good size gains. I get so fatigued. My strength doesn't really go up much. Every time I really prioritize strength, my size gains aren't a big deal because I have to lower the volume. And then, because let's say it's week 4 of 5-week program. Week 6 is a deload. On week 4, you're like, man, I could do another set of like high bar squats and get really pumped, nasty quads and grow, but I got to peak next week, so I'm just going to cut it. That's an inherent trade-off you're making, and there's no right answer. It's just a dilemma. It's which one do you do? Which problem do you want? Do you want too much fatigue but good muscle size, or do you want not enough fatigue or low fatigue, which is great, and better strength gains but less muscle size? At some point, when you get more advanced, you're going to realize I actually can't skin both of these cats at the same time. Why? Because I have to hold one cat down while skinning the other. And the other cat sees it coming. It knows that's its inevitability. Scott, how terrible is that visual?
It's bad.
It's bad. Stop the skinning cat analogies, folks. And by folks, I mean myself. In any case, at some point, as a more advanced person, you're probably going to want to at least try the phasic approach. Try to lean into several months of like mostly strength, a little bit of size, and then another several months of mostly size, a little bit of strength. You'll notice in most cases that as you switch off of one and switch to the other, you get amazing gains and then slower gains, and then you get too tired, then you switch the script again. It's a really, really good balance. So the easy answer, if you want both, train both at the same time until gains really start to drag, and then switch to the phasic approach, and you'll be having a good time. And if you want to do the phasic approach, a really good thing to do if you need a training app to do it with, the RP Hypertrophy app is the gold standard in the industry, I think, of apps that allow you to really focus on muscle size. So you can use that. And if you're really into the app situation, I would highly recommend the Juggernaut AI app by our good friend Chad Wesley Smith. It's like one of the strongest people, period. His app is excellent for strength. So during the phase where you're using hypertrophy, use the RP Hypertrophy app. During the phase for strength, use the Juggernaut AI app, and you get the best of all worlds, and you switch back and forth. And if you want to just use Juggernaut for muscle growth, it works great. If you want to just use our app and use some strength training in it, it works great. But for optimum, you need to try both apps, so that way we'll get more money and happiness or something. I don't know. Anyway, guys, I hope you found this video educational. And, just remember, people like Scott the Video Guy are real in this world. So don't trust everyone you meet. And I'll see you next time.
Hey.
Hey.